I was reading something, and I saw a title that talked about the 5 most consequential questions in life. And this particular article was written, or part of a book was written by a person that was dealing with the idea of God and whether God exists or not. And he was asking, and he suggested that there are 5 questions, and whether we answer those questions by faith in God, or whether we answer those questions by the physical sciences, that is, excluding the spiritual and thinking strictly from the standpoint of the physical, that it's going to really greatly affect our lives. And I got reading that, looking at the questions, and all he had was the questions asked. He didn't have an extensive group of answers. He was writing them as an introduction to something. But I got to thinking about it, and I thought, that's an interesting line of thought, and something I'd like to pursue on a Sunday evening, and that's what we're going to do here this evening. When we look at these questions, whether we look at them from the standpoint of the existence of God and therefore we believe in God, or whether we look at them from the standpoint that we don't believe in God, that He doesn't exist, our answers to these questions will be very different. And so as we begin to think about them, we're going to look first from the standpoint of myself as a Christian. I look at these questions, and when those questions are asked, I have an answer. And when I look at someone who doesn't believe in God, if these questions are asked, they really don't have an answer. So the consequence of our philosophy, whether we believe in God or we don't, is going to determine whether we have an answer at all to these questions. Because if we believe in God, God answers them. If we don't believe in God, then there is no answer, because we're left to our own devices, and the answer, I suppose, would be up to the individual as to what he chose it to be. First question that was asked, where did we come from? Well, that's an interesting question. If you are a person who believes in God, you believe the Bible to be the inspired Word of God, you can look over to the 2nd chapter of the book of Genesis, and he says, "These are the generations of the heavens and the earth when they were created, in the day that the Lord God made the earth and the heavens, and every plant of the field before it was in the earth, and every herb in the field before it grew. For the Lord God had not caused it to rain upon the earth, and there was not a man to till the ground. And there went up a mist from the earth and watered the whole face of the ground. And the Lord God formed man of the dust of the ground and breathed into his nostrils the breath of life, and man became a living soul." So, from the standpoint of a believer in God, and someone asks, where did mankind come from? Where did the human race come from? Then my answer would be, God created us, and God placed us here. So I have an ironclad answer to the question because of the faith that I have in God. Second question that then would be asked, who are we? That's a pretty interesting question. Who are we? If you go back to Genesis chapter 1 and verse 27, when he's talking about the creation, he said God created man in his own image. In the image of God created him, male and female created them. And the reason that this question of who are we is so important is because as human beings we have a realization, an embedded realization, that we are, to use the word exceptional. I'm not talking about in the sense of individually. I'm saying the human race is exceptional. That means it is an exception to the rule. If we look at everything else, and if you don't believe that, by the way, think about this. If there's a dog eating a piece of pizza on the side of the road and you stop and take it from him, can you be prosecuted for theft? Well, the answer is no. But if there's a person on the side of the road eating a pizza and you stop and demand it, then can you be prosecuted for theft? And the answer is yes. So all mankind realizes that we're exceptional. They realize that men are exceptional. So the only thing is, if you believe in God, you have an explanation for why. If you don't believe in God, you really don't. you can't really tell anyone why you think man is different. You're kind of like, one of the most famous answers that parents give to their children is because I said so. That's the most famous answer that we give. When we get frustrated and we really don't know the answer at all, we just say, well, because I said so. And that's kind of where man finds himself. If you ask man, why do we have these laws protecting human life, for example, and we don't have the same laws enforced protecting beef that are slaughtered for food, why? Well, the only answer they have is because I said so. We made an arbitrary decision that this animal is more important than that animal. But if you're a person who is a Christian, you say, because that man was created in the image of God and that cow was not. And so you have an ironclad answer, and it's kind of an interesting thought. And then you ask the question, why are we here? Well, that's an interesting question. And as a Christian, I have an answer. Ever thought about what God said twice, really, here? Here in verse 26, when he's talking about making man, he said, let us make man after our image and after our likeness, and let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the fowl of the air, and over the cattle, and over all the earth, and over every creeping thing that creepeth on the earth. You do realize that man is the most powerful, the most influential force on the face of the earth, period. Just think about it. I mean, you don't really have to look far. just drive to Lewisburg and drive down the street and look at all the automobiles. Horses don't ride in automobiles that they made. Dogs don't either. But man does. And when you look at all the crops, deer eat grass, etc. But deer doesn't plant a crop and develop fertilizers to fertilize it and herbicides to make it easier to grow them. Deer doesn't do that. But man does. Man has been given a charge by God that he is going to be, whether he likes it or not, in control in this world. And he has a lot to do with what goes on here simply because God has placed those things at his disposal. You just think of the things you see. When you see a man that weighs 150 pounds, and he's in complete control of an elephant, and I don't even know what an elephant weighs. It's beyond me. I didn't look it up before the lesson. When you go down to SeaWorld and you see a whale and you see a woman that might weigh 100 pounds and he's following her every command. The truth is that God said that man is here and he gives it a purpose. And he says they should have dominion over the fish of the sea, the fowl of the air, cattle, and over the earth, and over every creeping thing that creepeth in it. That's what he said. So that's why we're here. And then the next question comes to attention is this. How should we live? I mean, you think about it. If you think about a dog or a cat or a fish or a snake, did they ever sit down and seriously contemplate what should be the rules of my behavior? No. They don't do that. But man does. Man does that constantly. They think of the idea as what's acceptable behavior and what's not. We may sometimes disagree, but we understand there has to be a code of ethics. There has to be a code of conduct. And we understand that. And then that we're very different than anything else. Remember that when God created man back in the garden in chapter 2 and verse 15, and he took the man, put him in the garden, and then the Lord commanded him, saying, of every tree of the garden thou mayest freely eat. But, I don't know about you, but in my lifetime, that is a word that I don't have a lot of love for. Do you? I mean, when people say, well, this is the way it is, but, you listen to the doctor and he's telling you all this glorious news, and he says, but, and when he says that, there's something there not very pleasant. So God basically said to man, you go tend the garden, eat what you want, but there are limitations to your behavior. A lot of folks don't like limitations, but there are limitations to your behavior. He said, the tree of the knowledge of good and evil thou shalt not eat. That is the first statement of proper conduct for mankind. That's what it was. Now, in other areas, you may train a dog or a cat to do certain things, but if you leave them in a natural environment, they have no limitations to do whatever they please. But human beings, by nature, have rules to follow. And those rules are understood not from the standpoint of you get a treat if you do it and you get punished if you don't, but they're rules that are just understood that this is acceptable behavior and people understand it. And so therefore they conduct themselves in accord with it. And then there's this question of, where are we going? I mean, you ever stop and think about that? You reckon a cow, a dog, pig, a chicken sits around and considers, what will happen after I die? You reckon? But man does. Man thinks about that. It's a question in his mind. The book of Ecclesiastes chapter 12 it's really an interesting statement what he says, because this is a passage that recognizes that man is a twofold creature. That man is a spiritual being living in a physical body. And it recognizes that. And so when he talks about death, and he first describes it in a kind of a parable, the silver cord being loosed, the golden bowl being broken, the pitcher broken at the fountain, all that's talking about our life ends. And then he says, then shall two things happen. Then shall the dust return to the earth as it was. That is, the part of our spiritual body that's made up of the physical elements. And the spirit shall return unto God who gave it. And so he divides it up. And so he gives you an answer. And I think most people really it's something that even if you separate people in belief in God, I would have to think it worries them to think about, well, what's going to happen to me after I die? I mean, it's just hard to accept that you're just going to be living along and all of a sudden, wham, it's cut off and it ends. That's kind of hard for man to do because he's made in the image of God and he has a thought process that kind of makes that difficult to accept. But if he doesn't believe in God, that's what he's forced to accept. He has to accept the fact that when he dies, part of this equation will happen, part of it will not. You'll just return to dust and be as if you had never been. That's true. Now let's think a little bit. If we answer these questions by faith in the physical sciences, the answer to every one of those questions would be the same. And it would be we don't know. That would have to be the only answer we could give if we're simply looking at the physical sciences. And I'll tell you why. I'm not going to leave it at that. I want to go down the list again. And I want to tell you why I say that. When you consider mankind by faith in the physical sciences, and you don't take God into consideration at all, you just take the physical sciences that you are aware of, that you can study in a college or a high school or even an elementary school, and you can read books concerning the physical sciences, then here's what happens. Where did we come from? Well, the answer that's given most commonly today, if you don't believe in God, is evolution. That's where we came from. But then if you begin to press someone about that, is evolution scientific fact? Well, no. How do you know? How do you know? You know, when Paul talked about science, falsely so called, what he was really saying was this. Science, by definition, means incontrovertible knowledge. That's what it means. It would be interesting for you sometimes to listen to a group of evolutionists speak and have a discussion and to see how widely diverse they are in their opinions of what occurred because they don't know. You're talking about a hypothesis, a theory, but you're not talking about fact. Now, I believe in God. I accept fact. That's faith. I can't prove God's existence either by the physical scientists. I can see evidence of his existence, but I can't prove it. I haven't seen him, and I can't experience him with the five senses. So I can't prove it. And it would just be great if people who don't believe in God when they try to give you an answer, where did man come from, they just answer it honestly and say, well, here's the fact. We have faith that the physical conditions on the earth were such that it could create life, and an evolutionary process was possible over long, extended periods of time that could bring man into existence. And that's what we believe. So, in effect, what you're really saying is, I don't know. I don't know. And I don't have anything I can point to my finger to. I don't have any information available to me that will actually prove it to be true. Somebody asked me, can I prove the creation? Oh, I can't prove that either. But I have faith that that happened. The evolutionist doesn't. He has faith that it happened, but he doesn't have anything to base that on other than his imagination. Because there's just no information there that's possible to reach that conclusion from. It's just not. Here are two things you need to realize. Anything that is scientific fact is either scientific fact in one of two ways. We either see it happen or we can reproduce it in a laboratory. And if it's not those two things, it's not a scientific fact. It can be a theory, a hypothesis, a strong feeling in our gut. It can be a lot of things, but it can't be fact. So everybody just needs to understand that we're really answering these questions from a philosophical position. And one says, I believe in God, and here's the answer. The other says, I don't believe in God, and I don't know what the answer is. That's really where kind of we are. Let's think about this. Who are we? Well, are we a highly developed animal? Ask you something. Do you believe in your mind that there's any difference, any distinction between killing an earthworm and killing a cow? Is one more developed than the other? Yeah. Where does that stop? Why is it that when we come up this so-called evolutionary ladder and we come to an ape, gorilla, whatever you want, chimpanzee, whatever, that we think are our closest relatives, killing them cannot be prosecuted in court as a murder, but killing a person can. Where does that cutoff take place? Who decides that? Which animal becomes highly developed enough that we really put them in the class that we're going to say, okay, a murder has been committed? Who does it? Let me tell you something. It's kind of interesting. It doesn't prove any point. It's just an interesting observation that's made in Hebrews chapter 2. It's actually a quotation from Psalms 8 in answer to a question. He says in verse 6, for one in a certain place testified, saying, what is man that thou art mindful of him? That's an interesting question. Now, that's a direct question that was asked by the psalmist in Psalms 8. What is man that thou art mindful of him? Or the Son of Man that thou hast him? Why is man put up on a pedestal? Why? That's what the psalmist is asking, and then an answer is given. Thou madest him a little lower than the angels. Do we have spiritual powers as an angel? No. But he said you're a little lower. So I guess if you're looking at ranking persons, you would see God, you would see angels, you say man, is what he's saying. Made a little lower than the angels. Thou crownest him with glory and honor, and to set him over the works of thy hands. Thou hast put all things in subjection under his feet. From that he put all in subjection under him, he left nothing that is not put under him. So it's kind of interesting to see that, to look at that. So when you say, as a person who's looking strictly from the standpoint of the physical sciences, who are we? The only answer you can give them is highly developed animal. That's all you could say. You couldn't offer any other explanation other than that. Then there comes this question. Why are we here? Well, let me tell you something. If you look at a person who doesn't believe in God, and he is explaining the existence of the universe, whatever explanation he uses, since it could not have been planned, and it could not have been done by any type of intelligent being, then you would have to say it just came into existence. And then you would have to admit that not only did it just come into existence, it was pure accident. That everything that happened was accidental. And then if you look at the evolutionary process, you would have to say the same thing. It was all accidental too. I mean, we could have ended up looking much different if the evolutionary process had went different. We might have 4 ears and 16 eyes. But we don't, because the accident of evolution went in this direction. You can say it's the survival of the fittest or the selection process or whatever you want to say, but in the long run, there was no intelligence. It just accidentally occurred. And so our existence was the result of unplanned events. Now let me ask you something. If you have something that exists through an unplanned event, what purpose could it serve? When you go to the store and buy a pan to cook cornbread in, some engineer somewhere had a purpose in mind for that pan when he designed it, didn't he? And it was designed for that purpose. Now, do you think that man is any different than a cornbread pan? I mean, if you just threw a bunch of stuff out in the field and it threw out there and lightning struck it and melted it all, and it accidentally became this, would it have a purpose? No, it didn't have a purpose. It's just an accident that happened. It probably wouldn't serve much of a purpose if you ever deemed it had one. But you have to realize that if you're looking at something that you, by your own admission, are stating that this all came into existence purely by accident and there's no plan behind it, then what could you possibly say the purpose of that was? Couldn't have a purpose if it accidentally happened. The only reason things are built is because they serve a purpose. And we design them and build them to serve that purpose, which is what God did with man. It is my belief. There are two passages in the New Testament that's kind of interesting, because it talks about people being natural, brute beast. One of them is 2 Peter chapter 2, verse 12, and he said this: but these, as natural brute beast, made to be destroyed. All natural brute beasts came into existence for the only purpose they could have is to one day die. That's it. They didn't have any purpose beyond that, if you take God out of the equation. And he said, that's where natural brute beasts are. Now, in the book of Jude, he uses that word natural brute beast again. Talking of the same thing, but uses a little bit different language, and it's kind of interesting to consider what he said. He says there, in looking along there, that they are like natural brute beasts, in verse 10. These speak evil of those things which they know not. But what they know naturally is brute beast. In those things they corrupt themselves. You think about what he's telling you there. You ever hear the expression a bull in a china shop? What is that talking about? China is a very valuable commodity. It is appreciated by man. He takes great care to care for it. When you put a bull in a china shop, what does it do? It doesn't have any idea that has any value. And so it acts like a natural brute beast. And what would it do? It'd destroy the whole place in short order. That's what he's talking about in this passage. And that's the contrast that he's trying to draw. When he's asking the question and looking at these people, he's saying they don't understand why we're here. We're here at God's pleasure to serve Him. That's what our purpose is. And if we take that out of the equation, then we have a really serious problem. Because here's what we're forced to say. Where do we come from? I don't know. Why, who are we? I don't know. Why are we here? I don't know. That's a pretty bleak picture, isn't it? That we look at ourselves every day in the mirror. We get up and we look and we say, where did it come from? I don't know. Who is that? I don't know. Why is he here? I don't know. Think about this. How should we live? Now let's just follow the chain of thought again. Since we are a highly developed animal whose existence is accidental, with no purpose to our life, who's going to define what's acceptable? You think about that. Who's going to define that? Who's going to define what's acceptable if we're simply a highly developed animal Our existence was not purposed. It was simply accidental. Our lives have no purpose and serve no purpose. Who's going to define acceptable behavior? It's an interesting question to think about. Well, I'm going to tell you who does. I'm going to tell you who defines what is and what is not acceptable behavior. The Apostle Paul spoke of some people in the book of Philippians chapter 3. I should have said verse 18 and 20. For many walk, of whom I've told you often, and now tell you weeping, that they're enemies of the cross, whose end is destruction. Do you know why? He tells you why. Whose God is their belly, and whose glory is in their shame, who mind what? Earthly things. What does that tell you? They do whatever they want to do, and they don't feel they have any limitations. I think sometimes about a gun smoke I saw one time. A fellow liked killing people. He just enjoyed it. So he goes goes over to Marshal Dillon and tells him, I don't like anybody telling me what I can't do after he's killed someone. Who's to tell him that that's not acceptable? If he in fact is an animal. If he in fact came into existence by accident. And if he in fact had no purpose in his life. Who's going to tell him that? People need to stop sometimes and think of the consequence of their philosophies of life. Once you decide that God doesn't exist, then you're kind of like a ship at sea that has no motor and has no anchor, and it just goes wherever the waves push it. And that's what you end up being if you take God out of this equation. So you begin to understand why these 5 questions are so important. Last one, where are you going? Well, just got to think about it. You're just an animal. No moral responsibility. So as we look at it from the outside and we ask the question, where are we going? I guess we'd have to say, I don't know. I don't know what happens to animals when they die. I think all the people in rescue always talk about rainbow land as if there's a doggy heaven. I don't quite get that and don't quite believe that, but because they're not in the same category as man. But you really don't know. You're kind of forced, unless some spiritual being higher than you tells you, then you don't know. You don't know where you're going. You don't have any idea. In Romans chapter 14, there's an interesting statement. I know the context in which it's given, but I want to look at it just on its merit and just consider the truth that he states and not so much the context, because we're not really talking about what he's talking about here, but he makes a statement that is a statement of truth that he draws upon. It is written, as I live, saith the Lord, every knee shall bow to me, and every tongue shall confess to God. So then every one of us shall give an account of himself to God. Now let me ask you a question. Let's just suppose, for argument's sake, that God exists. And that you are made in His image and you do have moral responsibility. Let's just suppose that for a moment. Now let me ask you this question. Do you believe the line that you've heard all your life? Why we ever state something so silly, I don't know. It says what you don't know won't hurt you. Do you believe that? Do you believe what you don't know won't hurt you? Wasn't too long ago, someone that a lot of you know, maybe everybody here knew him, David Cook. David Cook went to the doctor, had an x-ray, found he had a terminal cancer that he did not know that he had. And in very short order, he died. He's no longer with us. Does it really true that what you don't know won't hurt you? Let's just suppose that God does exist, for sake of argument. And all the people we have in the world today who live as if He doesn't, and they stand before Him, are they going to be able to say, God, you're not real, and therefore I won't confess you, and therefore I won't allow you to judge me. I'm kind of reminded of a song I heard once. You probably have heard it too. Really an amusing song. Jerry Reed, and he's being arrested. And they have a police dog, and he's not going to get in that car, and tells him he's not getting in that car. Until the dog grabbed him, and then he decided he'd be glad to get in that car. You know, the truth is that what we believe in such circumstances doesn't alter reality. If God exists, then the truth is that we will confess Him, and we will stand before Him in judgment, and we will submit to whatever judgment He gives. But if you ask a person who doesn't believe in God, is that true? Let me tell you something that's really difficult. You know, it is really difficult, as they say, to prove a negative. When a person tells you there is no God, the one thing that always comes to my mind is this. If anybody ever tells me, I know positively there is no God, I'm going to ask a question invariably. And the question is going to be this. Do you know everything there is to know? Is there any fact that you don't know? Now, have you ever met a person that tell you he knows everything there is to know, and there is no fact that he doesn't know or she doesn't know? Have you ever met anyone that would be willing to say, I know everything? I haven't. And if they did, I think they were surely delusional. That would be so easy to disprove. Then the question comes. Now you're trying to tell me that you're going to prove to me that God doesn't exist. You reckon it's possible that there's one fact there that you're mistaken about, and maybe God does? I mean, people need to understand that the arguments that we hear sometimes are, they're saying, you prove to me that God doesn't exist. I can't do that. Can you? Can you prove to somebody? Absolutely. Beyond a shadow of a doubt, God doesn't exist. No, I can't do that. But on the other hand, I can ask the question, are you sure? If you look at the evidence, and we've had a lot of lessons about the evidence of God's existence, and I believe they're there. The strongest evidence is the evidence of design in everything that exists in this universe. To have no designer is just beyond me. But stop and think. These are the 5 most consequential. And why I say that is because these questions have consequences. How you answer them has a consequence. Where'd you come from? If you believe that you were created by God in His image, or you believe you're a highly developed animal, that's going to have a lot to do with how you conduct your life. Who are we? If I believe that I was created in the image of God, it's kind of like my daddy. I didn't want to insult his name. I don't want to insult God's name either. But if I just believe I'm a highly developed animal and I'm not created in the image of God, that's going to have a lot to do with the day I conduct my life. Consequential. Why are we here? If I believe that I'm here for the purpose, and the purpose that God has set me here is to glorify Him in discharging the duties and responsibilities He's given me, and that He is the one, when we ask the question, how should we live, that can outline what is right and what's wrong. And I don't have a right to do that. God does. But if I don't believe God exists, then I don't believe there's any way to determine that. So we get in our society, in our day, where we're basically told there is no right and no wrong. You do whatever you want. Where are we going? Well, if we believe we're just going to die, it's pretty dismal anyway. Who cares? What we do is inconsequential. How we live is inconsequential. How long we live, what we do with our life, none of those things have anything to do with consequences, because they don't matter. The only thing that makes it a meaningful question is if God exists. It's just a thought. I read it, I thought, I can't help it. It's just, I think, too good. I'm going to have to bring it, discuss it. I know it's something we talk about in some ways quite often, but on the other hand, sometimes we don't make it as specific as we have this evening. And it's an interesting thought. 5 consequential questions. How you approach those questions has a lot to do with how you're going to live your life. maybe has everything to do with how you're going to live your life. We're going to sing a song of encouragement. You know, one of the things I've often thought is when we look at the blood of Christ, and I hear people always talking about, well, I don't understand this, and this is just a kind of a mystical thing that people adhere to, and it's really just foolishness. And yet the same people will then talk about our freedom was purchased with blood when they're talking about the freedoms the Constitution provides us. Yeah, the blood's important. In this case, has a different significance, but it's something that washes away our sins, gives us freedom by obedience to the truth. Think about that as together we stand as we sing.